You can track a wounded buck for miles, reading signs in the dirt and broken branches. But sometimes the deepest wounds leave no tracks at all until it's too late. My name is Bryce Dalton. I'm 52, lean as a coyote, built for the woods. Got a scar over my right eye from a grizzly I got too close to as a kid. I wear camo more often than not because I'd rather blend in with the trees than stand out in a crowd. Grew up in the mountains of Montana, raised by a father who believed a man should know how to take care of himself, no excuses. He taught me how to hunt, track, read weather better than any weatherman ever could. These days, I make a living guiding city folks who think they know what survival means. Most don't last a night without a fire and a roof over their heads. My best company is my dog, Ranger. Never lied to me. Never let me down. I live on the outskirts of Bozeman, a good 30-minute drive from town. I built the cabin myself, piece by piece, with thick pine beams and a stone fireplace that could burn all winter. Got a truck that's seen better days but still runs because I know how to fix it. Life's been steady. Or at least it was. Regina and I had been married for 15 years. She was sharp, put together, always in control of herself. She liked things neat, organized. Where I belonged to the land, she belonged to town, warm cafes, clean countertops, well-tailored clothes. We made it work for a long time, maybe because we were opposites. But somewhere along the way, she started slipping away and I let her. I noticed it in small things first. She stopped waiting up when I came home late from a guide trip. She started wearing perfume again, but not around me. When I talked, she nodded, but her eyes weren't in the room. I should have asked questions. Should have pressed. But I've never been the kind of man to chase after something that wants to leave. So I wrote her letters. Real ones. Ink on paper. Not because I was trying to win her back, but because I needed to say things and talking didn't seem to work anymore. I told her about the way the air smelled before a snowstorm, about the night Ranger chased off a cougar from the cabin, about the way I still looked for her in the mornings before remembering she'd started sleeping in the guest room. She read them. She smiled. But her eyes were still somewhere else. One night, I came in late from town, the wind sharp enough to cut through my coat. The cabin was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock by the fireplace. Regina was in her study, door half open, light spilling onto the hardwood floor. I stopped in the kitchen, listening. She was humming something she never did anymore. I walked to the doorway, leaned against the frame. She didn't notice me at first. She was sitting at her desk, a neat stack of letters beside her, running her fingers over the paper like she was smoothing them out. My letters. I took a step inside. Didn't know you kept those? She jumped, turned quick, her hand covering the top letter like she was hiding something. Bryce, she breathed out like she'd been caught. I frowned, took another step. Something felt wrong. The way she was acting, the way her shoulders stiffened. I reached for the top letter, the one she'd been reading, and flipped it over. A name was written on the back. Daniel Pierce. The room got real quiet. I could hear the fire crackling in the other room, the wind howling against the window. My pulse slowed. Steady? I looked at her. She wasn't moving. Wasn't saying a damn word. I set the letter down. Nodded once. Huh. Then I turned and walked out. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me sharp, but it didn't register. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked to the truck, hands in my pockets, breathing slow. Ranger padded up beside me, ears perked, sensing something was off. I reached down, scratched behind his ear, more for me than him. I wasn't mad. Not yet. I was just taking it in. Like tracking a fresh set of prints in the woods. First, you read the ground, understand what you're looking at, then decide what to do. And I wasn't about to make a move without knowing every inch of this trail. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, let it idle while I stared out at the trees. Daniel Pierce. I didn't recognize the name. Didn't know what he looked like, what kind of man he was. But I knew enough. The letters were personal. Private. And she'd been feeding them to him like scraps to a stray. That's what got me. Not the affair, I'd been bracing for that. But using my words? The ones I meant for her? That was theft. I pulled out of the driveway, headed into town. Bozeman was quiet this late, a few bars still open, the neon lights humming. I parked in front of Grady's Tavern, an old spot I'd been going to for years. The kind of place where no one asked too many questions. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the smell of sawdust and whiskey settling into me like an old coat. Grady was behind the bar, polishing a glass, his gut pressing against the counter. He looked up, nodded. Bryce. I took a stool, tapped the bar. Whiskey. He poured without another word, setting the glass in front of me. I knocked it back, let the burn settle. Grady leaned in, voice low. Something on your mind? Or just drinking? I stared at the ice melting in the glass. You ever hear of a guy named Daniel Pierce? He frowned, scratched his jaw. Pierce. Yeah, therapist over on Main. One of those marriage counselors. Lotta women go to him, crying about their husbands, looking for a soft ear. His expression turned knowing. That name come up for a reason? I exhaled through my nose. You could say that. Grady poured another without asking. Tell me you didn't hit him. I gave a half smile. Not yet. He nodded, wiping the counter. Good. Some men ain't worth the trouble. I let the whiskey sit this time, rolling the glass between my hands. Grady knew better than to press. The place buzzed around me. Low laughter. The crack of a cue ball. The hum of a country song playing from the jukebox. But I wasn't really there. My mind was already working, piecing things together, slow and steady. Regina had been careful. No late-night phone calls, no obvious lies. She wasn't stupid. But now I had a name, and names were like tracks in the snow, you just had to know where to follow them. I left the bar after one more drink, the cold sobering me up fast. Ranger was waiting in the truck, his big brown eyes steady. I reached over, scratched his head. Looks like we got a hunt on our hands, boy. Back at the cabin, the lights were off except for Regina's study. I didn't go inside. Didn't want to see her. Instead, I went to the shed, grabbed a small lockbox from the shelf, and brought it inside. Sat at the kitchen table, opened it up. Inside was a burner phone I kept for emergencies, a notebook, a pen. I wasn't about to be the fool in this story. If Regina wanted to play quiet, I'd play quieter. I flipped open the notebook and started writing names, times, details. I'd track her like any other trail. Patient, steady, waiting for the right moment. Because the thing about tracking is, when you know the land, when you know the signs, the animal never sees you coming. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of day where the sky presses low, and the air smells like snow. I brewed a pot of coffee, black as motor oil, and stood by the window, watching the tree line. Regina's car was still in the driveway. She hadn't gone anywhere last night. Maybe she thought we were going to talk. We weren't. I had tracking to do. Ranger sat at my feet, ears up, waiting. I scratched his head, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside. The wind cut sharp, but it felt good. Cleared my head. First stop was town. I drove past Pierce Family Counseling, a clean little building off Main Street, tucked between a yoga studio and a boutique selling overpriced candles. The sign out front had his name in neat, professional letters. Daniel Pierce, licensed therapist. Didn't look like much. Probably had a soft voice, gentle handshake. The kind of guy who says things like, I hear you, that must be hard. The kind of guy who lets women cry to him about their husbands, then tells them they deserve more. I pulled into a parking lot across the street, killed the engine and watched. It was early, but a few cars were already there. Women mostly, one after another, stepping inside, looking over their shoulders like they didn't want to be seen. Interesting. I sat for a while, taking it in. Didn't need to go knocking on doors. Not yet. Tracking wasn't just about footsteps. It was about waiting, letting the prey move how it wanted before you closed in. After an hour, I had what I needed. Regina had a pattern. Wednesday afternoons, she had errands in town. Now I knew exactly where those errands led. I left, stopping by Lynn's coffeehouse on my way back. Lynn was Regina's closest friend, had been for years. Sharp woman, ran the place like a drill sergeant but had a soft spot for regulars. When I walked in, she was behind the counter, arguing with a supplier over the phone. She saw me, held up a finger, finished her call. Bryce, she said, setting her hands on the counter. Haven't seen you in a while. Coffee? I nodded. Black. She poured, slid the cup over. You look like you got something on your mind. I took a sip, let the heat settle. You know Daniel Pierce? Her mouth pressed into a thin line. Why? I hear Regina's been seeing him. Lynn exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. Jesus. I was hoping you wouldn't find out like this. That was all the confirmation I needed. How long? I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the door like she was weighing her words. Few months, maybe more. She said it was just talking. That she needed someone to listen. I let out a low chuckle. Yeah, I bet he's real good at listening. Lynn leaned on the counter. Look, Bryce. I didn't like it. I told her she needed to figure things out with you, not some therapist. But she wasn't listening. I nodded, finishing my coffee in one long sip. Appreciate it, Lynn. She sighed, rubbing her temple. What are you gonna do? I set the cup down, grabbed my hat. Same thing I do every time I track something. Which is? I pulled the door open, cold air rushing in. Make sure it doesn't see me coming. I drove home with the radio off, the weight of what I'd learned settling in like a thick coat. There wasn't much surprise in it, just confirmation. I'd spent enough time tracking animals to know the signs of something slipping away, and Regina had been slipping for a long time. I just hadn't decided what to do about it until now. Back at the cabin, I made a call. Clint Morrow was a retired cop who did some private work on the side. We'd known each other for years, ran into each other at the range or the feed store. He wasn't cheap, but he was good. He picked up on the second ring. Bryce. I need some eyes on someone, I said, getting straight to it. Clint sighed. You finally putting that wife of yours in the ground? I smirked. Not yet. Just need to know exactly where she's been going. Who she's been with. A pause. You already know, don't you? I need proof. Clint was quiet for a moment. Send me what you got. I hung up and texted him Pierce's name, address, and office hours along with Regina's usual errand schedule. I didn't need to follow her myself. That would be sloppy. Instead, I'd let Clint do what he did best, dig up every detail, every piece of evidence. I spent the rest of the day working in the shed, fixing up an old rifle someone had brought me for repairs. Kept my hands busy, kept my head clear. By the time the sun started dipping below the treetops, my phone buzzed. Clint. Got something for you, he said. Go ahead. She's been seeing him outside his office. Hotel on the west side. They're careful, separate cars, staggered arrivals, but not careful enough. I got pictures. I closed my eyes, exhaled. Send them. A few seconds later, my phone pinged. I swiped through the photos. Regina, hair pulled back, stepping into a side door at the Willow Creek Inn. Pierce, 5 minutes later, same entrance. Another shot of them leaving, separate but too close to be a coincidence. That was it then? No more wondering. No more maybes. Clint's voice came through the phone. What's next? I stared at the pictures a moment longer, then slipped the phone into my pocket. I take my time. The next few days, I moved quiet. Watched. Listened. Gathered more. Regina had always been careful, always kept up appearances, but I could see the cracks forming. She was more distracted than usual, checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. I caught her staring at me sometimes, like she was trying to figure out what I knew. She hadn't said a word about that night I found the letters, and neither had I. But the air between us had changed. She could feel it. I went to Lynn's again, this time late in the evening when the place was winding down. She gave me a long look as I took a seat at the counter. You're working something, she said, pouring my coffee without asking. I stirred in some sugar, slow. You still talk to Regina? Sometimes. She hesitated. Why? I need you to do something for me. She crossed her arms, leaning on the counter. Bryce, if you're gonna do something stupid. I met her eyes. Nothing stupid. Just need you to talk to her. See where her head's at. Lynn sighed, rubbing her forehead. She's not gonna tell me anything if she thinks I'm working for you. She doesn't need to. I just need to know if she feels guilty. If she's planning anything. Lynn studied me for a moment, then shook her head. You're playing this real slow. I took a sip of coffee. Only way to hunt. 2 days later, she called me. I talked to her. And? She's nervous. Said you've been acting different. She thinks you know something. I nodded, watching the fire in my fireplace crackle low. Good. Bryce, Lynn hesitated, then sighed. She's not leaving. She thinks she's got this under control. Whatever you're planning it. I've already got everything I need. A long silence. Then, quietly, she doesn't deserve a man like you. I let out a breath. I know. I hung up and leaned back, staring into the flames. Everything was in place now. I had the evidence, the proof, and a plan. Now it was just a matter of when. I woke up before dawn, same as always. Made coffee, fed Ranger, and stepped out onto the porch while the sky was still dark. The air was crisp, carrying the weight of winter, the kind that settled into your bones. I stood there, letting the cold wake me up proper, thinking through the next steps. I had the proof. I had the timing. Now it was about execution. Regina still hadn't said a word. She could feel something shifting, but she didn't know what. I caught her watching me in the kitchen that morning while I fixed eggs and toast, her fingers drumming against her coffee mug. She wanted to ask something but didn't. She was waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't. Instead, I went into town. First stop was the bank. I'd already been shifting money around the past few weeks, making sure everything was lined up. The house was mine, signed off before we were married. The accounts, though, needed to be cleaned up. I closed our shared credit card, pulled some cash, and moved my direct deposits into an account she couldn't touch. The woman at the desk, a polite older lady named Darlene, glanced at me when I handed over the forms. "You and Regina okay?" I gave a slow nod. "We will be." She hesitated but didn't press. She just stamped the paperwork and slid it back to me. Next stop was the lawyer. I'd already had a consultation, but now I was making it official. No hesitation. No second-guessing. I handed over the file Clint had put together, photos, texts, the whole trail. The lawyer, Rick Landry, flipped through it, nodding. "This is solid." He set the papers down, folded his hands. "You want to go after her legally, you could get just about everything. Especially since she used marital funds to keep this thing quiet, hotels, gifts, whatever else she spent." I shook my head. Not interested in bleeding her dry. Just making sure she walks out with as little as possible. Rick smirked. "You'd be surprised how much that stings on its own." I stood, shaking his hand. "File it." Back in the truck, I checked my watch. It was still early, but I had one last stop. Regina's parents. They lived on the other side of town, a nice house, the kind with a perfectly trimmed lawn even in winter. I knocked once and waited. A few seconds later, Ellen, her mother, opened the door. Her eyes widened. "Bryce. What a surprise." I nodded. "Need to talk to you and Robert." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, then stepped aside. "Come in." I followed her into the living room where Robert, her father, was sitting with a book. He looked up, frowned when he saw me. "Something wrong?" I sat across from him, setting a folder on the coffee table. "You should see this." Ellen took a seat beside him, looking between me and the folder. Robert opened it, eyes narrowing as he flipped through the contents. The room went real quiet. Ellen pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Robert set the papers down, jaw tight. "She told us things were rough between you two, but this?" He looked up, anger creeping into his voice. "She's been lying to us." I nodded. "She's been lying to everyone." Ellen exhaled shakily. "Does she know you have this?" "Not yet." I leaned forward, resting my arms on my knees. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know before it comes out. And because I want you to think about what happens next. You've always supported her, but after this you need to ask yourselves if she deserves it." Robert looked away, rubbing his temple. "Damn it, Regina." Ellen swallowed hard. "What are you going to do?" I stood, adjusting my jacket. "End it." They didn't try to argue. Didn't try to make excuses for her. That told me everything I needed to know. I left without another word. In the truck, I let out a breath. Piece by piece, it was all falling into place. By the end of the day, there'd be nothing left for her to stand on. And that was exactly how I wanted it. By the time I got back to the cabin, Regina was home. Her car was in the driveway, parked straight like she'd been sitting there a while before coming inside. I stepped in, took off my coat, and found her in the kitchen, standing by the sink, hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You were out early," she said without turning around. "Had things to take care of." I walked past her, set my keys on the table, and grabbed a glass from the cupboard. She turned then, eyes sharp, but there was something underneath, uncertainty. She could feel the shift, the way the ground was tilting beneath her feet. She wanted to know how much I knew. She just wasn't brave enough to ask. Instead, she tried a different approach. "I was thinking we should talk." I took a slow sip of water, leaned against the counter. "About what?" She hesitated. "About us." I let the silence sit. Let her squirm. Finally, I nodded. "All right. Let's talk." She straightened like she'd won something, like I was finally giving her an opening. "Things haven't been easy between us. I know that. And I know I haven't been as present as I should be, but..." I held up a hand. "Save it." She blinked. "What?" I pushed off the counter, pulled the folder out from where I'd set it on the table, and slid it across to her. "Go on. Take a look." Her fingers hovered over it for a second, then she flipped it open. The color drained from her face. Her throat worked, like she was trying to swallow but couldn't. I crossed my arms, watching. "Go ahead, Regina. Keep telling me how things haven't been easy. How you weren't as present as you should have been." She closed the folder, pushed it away like it burned. "Where did you get this?" I let out a short laugh. "That's what you're worried about?" She swallowed. "Bryce, I don't..." I cut in. "I don't want an explanation. I don't want an apology. I just want you to listen." She clamped her mouth shut. I exhaled slowly, rolling my shoulders, keeping my voice even. I know everything. I know about the hotel, the meetings outside his office, the money you spent keeping it quiet. I know about the letters. I know about Daniel. I stepped closer, dropping my voice. I also know that you went to your parents, told them I was the problem, that I was distant, cold, that you needed someone to talk to. Her breath hitched. I nodded. Yeah, that's done too. I met with them this morning. They know everything now. She took a shaky breath, her hands clenching into fists. You blindsided me. I barked out a laugh. Blindsided you? That's rich. I shook my head. You had months, Regina. Months to be honest. Months to come clean. Instead, you kept sneaking around, kept lying. You had the chance to leave. You didn't. And now you don't get to play the victim. She was breathing hard, shoulders rising and falling. What do you want? I already filed. You'll get the paperwork soon. I grabbed my coat, slipping it back on. You'll also notice the accounts are different. I made sure you get exactly what you deserve. No more, no less. Her face twisted, eyes flashing with something sharp. You can't just. I can, I said flatly. And I did. She pressed her lips together so tight they went white. You want to punish me? No, I said, staring her down. I want to make sure you face what you did. I want to make sure you don't walk away thinking you got one over on me. I let my voice drop lower. And I want to make sure you understand that from here on out, you don't matter to me anymore. That hit harder than anything else. I could see it in the way her eyes flickered, the way her breath stuttered. She could handle anger, could handle yelling. But indifference? That was something else entirely. I grabbed my truck keys. I'll be back later. Don't be here when I am. I walked out without looking back. A week passed. The house was quiet. No perfume lingering in the air. No careful footsteps moving through the kitchen. No voice asking if I'd be home late. Just me, Ranger, and the sound of the fire crackling at night. Felt cleaner that way. Regina moved out fast. Didn't even try to fight it. She packed her things in silence, eyes darting to me every so often like she was waiting for me to snap, to let something slip. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Just stood by the door with my arms crossed, watching. When she was done, she hesitated, like she wanted to say something. I opened the door before she could. She walked out, and that was the last I saw of her. Didn't mean the ripples stopped, though. Bozeman wasn't a big town, and people talked. Word got around about what she did, about who she did it with. Lynn told me folks had stopped inviting her to their usual circles. Her parents weren't returning her calls. Her mother had come into the coffee shop one morning, sat down, and just stared out the window for a long time before saying, I didn't raise her for this. Daniel Pierce closed his practice. Some legal trouble, something about inappropriate relationships with clients. Probably not the first time he'd done this, just the first time he got caught. He was trying to relocate to Idaho last I heard. Maybe Montana had gotten too small for him. Didn't matter to me. The divorce went through without much resistance. My lawyer made sure she got the minimum, and I made sure she knew why. No fights, no drawn-out court dates. Just paperwork and signatures. Clean. I spent more time in the woods after that. Took on more clients for the guiding business. Expanded my survival courses for young men. They needed it. Too many boys these days growing up soft, lost. Figured if I could pass on what my father taught me, that was a damn sight more useful than anything they'd learn in a classroom. One evening, I was sitting out on the porch, a beer in my hand, Ranger lying at my feet. The sky was streaked orange, fading into deep blue, the air carrying that crisp bite of oncoming winter. Lynn pulled up in her old Jeep, dust kicking up behind her tires. She stepped out, leaned against the hood, arms crossed. You good? She asked. I took a sip of my beer, nodding. Yeah. She studied me for a second, then shook her head with a small smile. You don't look like a man who just went through a divorce. I smirked. Maybe because I'm not. She huffed a laugh. Well, whatever it is, you look better than you did a few months ago. I just shrugged. Feels better. No more dead weight. She nodded, understanding. You ever gonna start dating again? I gave her a look. Lynn. She held up her hands, laughing. All right. Just curious. I didn't need to explain. Wasn't in a rush. Wasn't looking. Some men aren't built for chasing things that don't want to be caught. And I wasn't about to waste another damn minute on someone who didn't know what loyalty meant. She pushed off the Jeep. Well, I brought you a pie. Don't ask if I made it because we both know I didn't. I took the tin from her hands, smirked. Damn shame. Guess I'll eat it anyway. She grinned, heading back to the driver's side. See you around, Bryce. I watched her go, then set the pie on the table and sat back down. The sky had turned darker now, the first stars pricking through. Ranger let out a low sigh, shifting against my boots. I reached down, scratching behind his ears. We did all right, huh, boy? He thumped his tail against the wood. I leaned back, taking another sip of beer, staring out into the trees. The past was dead and buried. And the future was mine.